Good evening and welcome to Bangalore International Center, a public platform for informed conversation, art, and culture. Today we are talking about rethinking built heritage, looking beyond monuments and history. When we think of built heritage, we tend to envision a monument such as an ancient temple, a tomb, a fort, a palace, one that belongs to a distant past that is unconnected to present day life and is isolated within its own precinct. We tend to look mainly at its physical form, perhaps tie that form to the history of some king who ruled eons ago, and we associate the preservation of that form with an organization such as the Archaeological Survey of India. And we often view it as a visual spectacle to be enjoyed, perhaps when we travel. But built heritage does not fall so easily into such neat slots. It is often in the heart of our cities, and decisions on how we shape our cities today affect it. It cannot be easily isolated in a past, as many heritage structures are still in use. The past of heritage is rarely clear in black and white and requires an appreciation of its nuance, complexity, and contradiction. Some heritage is privately owned and not under the control of a governmental agency like the Archaeological Survey. Heritage is much more than a physical form or a historical narrative and has both tangible and intangible dimensions. And how does the past of built heritage affect our present? What loss would we suffer in the present if we did not have built heritage in our lives? We grapple with these questions and more in this evening's discussion. And to help us, we have two seasoned professionals in the field, Ratish, Nanda, and Gurmeet, conservation architects who have been working for many years on the conservation of built heritage. The format of our evening is first, each of the panelists will make a presentation. After that, we will have a moderated discussion with the panel. And then in the final section, we will take questions from the audience. Please enter your questions in the Q&A box. With that, we move on to our presentations, and I request Ratish Nanda to start the ball rolling with his presentation. Ratish.
Thank you, Prem. Thank you for thinking of this topic. A lot of the problems that ail conservation in India are really concerned about the fact that we've been too focused, as you said, on the building itself. And to an Indian audience, it's considered throwing good money after bad, because the ultimate aim. So what we at the Aga Khan Trust have been doing, both in our projects in Delhi and Hyderabad, is trying to demonstrate how conservation can actually meet a lot of the government objectives. It could meet even the sustainable development goals or earlier the millennium development goals. So in the 15 minutes that I have, I'm just going to try and sort of, take you through some pretty pictures to show how exactly, we've been able to do that. This is the state of most of our heritage, hemmed in by modern construction. This, of course, is the Qutub Shahi tombs that stand, and this is a photograph taken from the Golconda Fort. So, and that is the state of most of our heritage in India. This is our other sort of Karma Bhumi, the Humayun's tomb, Nizamuddin, Sundar Nursery area in Delhi. And this is what it would have appeared in the 19th century before building activity started, built along the river in Delhi. This is how it is today. You can't really think of the monuments without thinking of all of the people who live around it. So for us, as part of the Aga Khan Development Network, our objective has always been to use conservation or even culture as a stepping stone towards improving quality of life. And this quality of life is not only for this community, but a wider Delhi community or a Hyderabad community, and also an international community that comes and enjoys these sites. These are two of my favorite pictures, and many of you sort of watching today, if you've ever heard me speak before, would have seen these. These are just two very powerful images So in 1993, Humayun's tomb was declared a World Heritage Site by UNESCO, and the ICOMOS report actually said that one of the conditions of granting that designation was that the gardens need to be restored. And if you look at this picture, you see a lot of inappropriate 20th century planting, the Ashoka trees, you see neglect, you see this octagonal canopy platform which was used by Emperor Akbar as a throne, almost dismantled. You see cement covering the waterfalls and so on. I won't go into further details, but after in 1997, His Highness the Aga Khan gifted to India on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of India's independence the garden restoration of Humayun's tomb. And these two pictures really relate of what happened. Now, this is just a before and after. But the message behind this is that gardens, for one, are as important as the buildings themselves. The Florence Charter and a lot of thinking since the 1970s world over emphasizes on the immediate setting of monuments to be as important as the monument itself. And this garden restoration led to almost 1,000% increase in visitor numbers. What we invested here is today less than a year's ticket revenue, because when we started there were 160,000 visitors. Today you get over 2 million visitors a year, pre-COVID, of course. Since then, we got engaged with a much wider project in Delhi. This was signed in 2007 and includes today the project area spread across 300 acres in the heart of Delhi, and follows very much the historic urban landscape approach of UNESCO, which was notified in 2015. But we've been following this since the 1980s in our project in Cairo, Zanzibar, Kabul, Lahore, and so on. Pretty pictures. This is the Humayun's tomb complex, very green. All of these monuments are really centered around this dargah. It is the 14th century dargah of Hazrat Nizamuddin Auliya, and Sundar Nursery. So these, and Sundar Nursery, and more recently Rahim's Mausoleum. So these four form the four sort of pegs of the whole project area, 300 acres that we work around. Now, what I'm going to show you is also not possible to do individually. Prem, you mentioned at the beginning in your introduction about a monument being limited to the Archaeological Survey of India, and that is one of the problems. So the only reason we've been able to do all of this is sign a single piece of paper with the CPWD, the Municipal Corporation of Delhi, and the Archaeological Survey of India. We also see ourselves as a platform for on which partnerships are built. And we've been very, very fortunate that over the last 15 years, we've had support not only from the government of India, but also, respectable institutions in themselves, such as the Tata Trusts in India, Ford Foundation, also international commitments, the Norwegians, the Germans, and the Americans being amongst our principal international partners as government. And more recently, corporate funding through Havels and Interglobe or Indigo Foundation. So this has been critical to, and is critical if you want the monument-centric approach to go, is both public-private partnership as well as building on this. Very quickly, one of the things about rethinking conservation is also do the process properly, which is also not done. So I know this is not the thing, but we introduced in 2008 this technology, which I think needs to go across India to document. But this, this is a slide from Hyderabad. This is a Bauli, a 16th century Bauli, which had collapsed. And we required almost 600 cubic meters of stone to rebuild this Bauli, reconstruct it. And when we started this project in Hyderabad, we were actually buying water, even for our conservation. There were tankers coming. It was painful. It was really painful. But not only has this 16th century structure been reconstructed, but one of the critical things in conservation is archival research. So we realized that one of the reasons, and that it had collapsed before and from the similar place, and the arcade was rebuilt about 100 years ago only. Now, this led us to form various repairs, which I won't get into. But what is critical is that the Baoli today holds 3 million liters of water every rainfall. Now, even if you put that at 1 rupee a liter, you're recovering the cost of undertaking that conservation every year, and in manifold approach. So literally that Baoli right now has 3 million liters of water, and put a cost to that. What else have we been able to achieve? You know, we've done about, in the last 15 years, almost 2 million man days of work for master craftsmen. These are stone carvers, plasterers, tile makers, and so on. And in 2014 or 15, the national policy was changed, and craftsmanship is supposed to be critical to what the ASI does. It's yet to be put in practice. But we've over and over demonstrated that the only way these historic buildings and even historic craft skills are going to survive is if modern architecture includes these craft skills. Peer reviews. And finally, World Heritage. We expanded the World Heritage site to include 12 additional monuments. And you know, this is important because this is a recognition that the historic site is not limited to that, but is actually spread out to its historic influence. And you know, we're very fortunate here that a lot of the 16th century precinct is still secure, both in Hyderabad and in Delhi. This slide should have come up further, but you know, the conservation of the Baoli was really coupled with regrading earth across a 106-acre complex, and to create a master plan that includes already planted 8,000 trees. So you're actually in India, we need to couple conservation with environment, because the environment activism, the environment lobby, the environment is much ahead. And over here, we've been able to create buffer zones, plant a lot of, both in Delhi and Hyderabad, plant trees and create ecological buffer zones of significance, over 40 acres over here. So that's what happens. And then community engagement. One of the first things we did here was to fix a 15th century Eidgah, which now has about 80,000 people praying twice a year. And that not only builds trust, but also allows the community to find meaning in the work that is done. Similar work's been done in Delhi, in the Hazrat Nizamuddin Basti, where we've coupled historic building conservation with health initiatives, sanitation, culture, schools, education, vocational training, and so on. Now, in the 15 minutes I have, of which about 6 are left, I can't get into all of that, but you know, this is the philosophy that we really work in. And as I said, we're part of the Aga Khan Development Network. We work in 30 countries, and every agency of the Aga Khan Development Network aims to improve quality of life. We at the Aga Khan Trust for Culture really do it through leveraging cultural assets for social economic gain. So this is the Baoli. Again, this had collapsed in 2008, and this was one of the first interventions we did in Hazrat Nizamuddin Basti. But for this, we needed to build 40 households elsewhere, and it's been an incredible small urban conservation project that continues to this date. We're working there still since 2008, and addresses a lot of issues that are important for the day-to-day life of the community who live here. This was a public park. So when we did our first baseline survey in Nizamuddin, people said then 1% of people had been to a public park because they had all been taken over, and so this was converted after. I mean, these are pretty pictures, but it takes about 4 to 5 years here to here in terms of permission, in terms of figuring out with the community what usage there will be, etc., etc. One of the other things, we had this Mcd School which had 40 kids. Now it has about 400. It went up to 600, but we renovated the whole school. But with that, placed community teachers here. Now this is all part of a conservation effort. And it is important for me to say that the education and the health services that we started providing in Nizamuddin actually predated any conservation effort. And this is very important because we all go as conservationists and we say, community should take care of its heritage. Community can hardly take care of their own basic needs or take care of the heritage. I think we need to flip that around and sort of say the heritage needs to take care of the community. There's no reason cities like Agra or Delhi need to have any poverty. Nowhere in the world, when you have such heritage, would you have poverty. We realized less than 5 or 6% of women had any sort of economic opportunities. So we reintroduced crafts. Now these women make craft. There is another group I'm very proud of who make incredible Nizamuddin cuisine, also intangible heritage. So creating a lot of the projects really been women centric, including building a large community toilet complex, as 25% of the community did not have in-home toilets. And there you get about 4 million pilgrims a year. And then urban improvement. So this was what is Nala, and you can see a lot of Malba garbage. So we had this took about 7 years, and about 30-member team was working on this. Not only first did we have to connect about 200 toilets to sewer lines because they were literally dropping their sewage down to the Nala, but we had to create a waste collection system. And 5-6 years later, this has been transformed to that, including creation of an open space. Again, this is a 1-hour lecture in itself of all that happened here. But this is as much part of conservation as Humayun's tomb. And it takes an interdisciplinary team. This is a dated photograph. It's about 7 years old. But on the team are about at least 20 different disciplines, represented. And I was so worried that I'll lose my internet connection that I rushed through that presentation with 2 minutes to spare, Prem. Thank you.
Thank you, Ratish. That was really interesting. Raises many questions which you'll return to in the discussion. And now to Gurmeet Rai. Over to you, Gurmeet.
Thank you. Is that visible?
Yes.
So thank you. Ratish makes my work much easier, but I mean, there'll be a lot of repetitions though. What I hope to share today is, my view on heritage conservation, because there's a lot of accumulated experience and knowledge of learnings and unlearnings that have happened over the last, over almost 30 years of practice in heritage sector. But the work that I do is primarily been in the government space. I mean, my projects, the ones I do, are basically funded by government and through a public procurement process. So it's like a lot of projects which take a lot of time, they run parallelly, and we do not, one does not have the indulgence of being too prescriptive many times. So for this particular forum, I'd like to go over some of the legacy that we have inherited in heritage practice. So simple points to begin with, that of course Archaeological Survey of India, which Prem has already mentioned, 100-year-old legacy of heritage practice in the country, enabled by law. The basic format being that of protection against encroachment and misuse. And one important thing that they do is improve access to the heritage sites. Scientific conservation is what has been their, I would imagine, pillar of strength, because what they really work on is the monument itself. And in terms of public use, the space becomes a regulated public space. Some of the, that is something which is a legacy that was inherited 75 years ago. And ever since independence of the country, there are some indicators of change. And that kind of is very important to examine, that where are we going with our heritage practice in this country. Heritage conservation and management, if one were to see that in till the 1950s, the Archaeological Survey of India was under the Ministry or the Department of Education, because I kind of examined some of the parliamentary debates, because, you know, the initial act that protected heritage was said sites and monuments of archaeological significance. And when the act was modified post-independence, I think in 1951, they replaced the word archaeology of archaeological significance by monuments of national significance. So or national importance. So what it really needed was that from the entire list of monuments protected by the ASI, they were required to prepare two lists. Something for Government of India to look after and a large number of sites for the state governments to look after. They were even required to define that what was the criteria that separated the national significance from regional significance. And that never got done, because I looked at some of the parliamentary debates on the matter. Subsequently, the monuments came under the protection, the ASI came under Ministry of Culture. And at some point, culture and tourism came together. And at some point, it even got separated with one minister. So today, the trajectory is that heritage conservation protection is come into the domain, more into the Ministry of Tourism. And I would imagine, and I mean, for want of a better word, I would say, ASI continues to work within their format, which they've inherited, and all the expanded scope has actually moved into the domain of Ministry of Tourism. With schemes like Adopt a Heritage, Swadesh Darshan, and Prasad. Now, a lot of us have a lot of observations and issues with the way some of this stuff is happening in the country, specifically related to Adopt a Heritage scheme. The Ministry of Housing and Urban Affairs has also delved into heritage conservation and heritage development around historic areas under programs like Hriday and Smart City. Then, of course, you have Ministry of Environment and Forests that also looks at. Now, World Heritage, I did not mention earlier, that ever since the convention was signed, to which India is a signatory in 1972, is when the convention was out. Ministry of Environment and Forests has been nominating natural heritage sites, and Ministry of and Archaeological Survey of India has been the nodal agency for nominating cultural heritage sites for World Heritage inscription. Now, primarily, most of this is a top-down kind of working with heritage. So what is happening? We need to look at heritage mandate. So under the 7th schedule, you do see cultural heritage on the concurrent list. So it's an obligation of both center and the state government. It's silent on local government. What is the role of local governments vis-a-vis the state governments? And I work locally. So for me, this is kind of very important. Urban development is on the state list. So when programs like Hriday and Smart City come in, and Government of India endows the states with a certain amount of grant and some amount of matching funds that come from the state government, what happens at the local level? You land up working with the urban local bodies in the area of heritage conservation, protection, development, with no supporting law that is there at the state level, at the local level. Now, there are few states like Maharashtra and some odd examples here and there where they've kind of put in a heritage committee and put heritage cells, but this is not the scale at which you want to function in a country as vast as India, as diverse as India, as rich in heritage and fast depleting heritage as India. The international trajectory, meanwhile, you have UNESCO with the ICOMOS as an international, as 3 advisory bodies that you have to UNESCO, ICOMOS being one on cultural heritage, IUCN on natural heritage, and ICROM that actually takes upon itself for training and capacity building. The recent 5 years or 10 years of work has seen a development, the charters that Ratish was talking about the Florence Charter and so on, is something you see till the 90s and so on. But in the more recent past, you see what the world is talking about, the international platforms on heritage practice. They're talking about nature and culture as connecting practice. IUCN and ICOMOS collaborating, advising UNESCO on this particular shared work. rights-based approaches in heritage management has become very big with ICOMOS. In fact, it was brought into to the World Heritage Committee in 2019, I think, when amendments were done to the operational guidelines of the World Heritage Convention, making communities central to heritage management practice. Water and heritage is a very important working group in ICOMOS, and climate change and cultural heritage is the other area of work. Now, I thought it was very important for us to look at all of this when we look at what is happening in our country and what is the catch up that we need to do, and not with singular projects, but at policy level that impact the landscape of this country. I would like to draw your attention to a little project that I did in the year 1999-2000. Under the program of UNESCO, they actually declared the year 2000 as the International Year for Culture of Peace. 5 years before that, with a team of architects and conservation architects, I had navigated the landscape of Punjab. And I'd realized that, that we in colleges learn about heritage conservation in terms of material fabric. We talk about a bit of communities. When I went to college, there was no conversation on communities. We just managed to understand what built heritage was all about. And we began the process of trying to understand. And I realized that there was a lot out there in the landscape which we are not taught about. We, in fact, when we experience it, we did not even have the tools to capture it appropriately in terms of communicating that heritage is not about just brick and mortar, there's more to it. So one felt quite inadequate, in terms of first understanding, and then when you felt it, it wasn't about the brain, it was the heart. And then how do you capture it? So I came across this particular temple in a little village called Kishankot, and I was mindful that Ratish has these very, very interesting monumental structures, so I should bring a little one from the rural hinterland. So this little temple is a courtyard temple in Punjab, in this little village, and the project was supported by UNESCO, and with a matching grant from the UNDP, United Nations Volunteers Program, from the Archaeological Survey of India, under their program of giving 5 lakhs for unprotected buildings, conservation of unprotected buildings. So that was the only program by which ASI would fund unprotected heritage. So it's very important to know that, look, why do we have issues? What is the reason why we are looking the way we are looking? What is there in policy and in our schemes and programs and financial tools and institutional structures that are actually the reason why we have the challenges on the ground and where the fixing needs to be done? So this particular temple had the most diverse themes of wall paintings. What we saw in Kishankot was continuing practice, daily care by the custodians. We saw grassroots social action for protection of the monument, where the community had this particular village had about 100 households, and how they rallied. These were Dalit Sikhs, Dalit Hindus, Dalit Christians in this village, and how they protected the village because, Punjab had seen a period of militancy. The Thakur family that owned the temple had actually left the temple and had sold their land and moved to a city. And there were about 4 acres of land attached to the temple, and how the community rallied to actually protect the 4 acres because of which the temple got protected. The reason why they protected the 4 acres was because on 1 acre, they had a village water tank, and which was getting all the wastewater of the village. And they were threatened that that particular piece of land would get acquired by a powerful landowner owner who would make it into a field. And when I asked these women that, why did you even do this? Because then from this little village, they went all the way to the High Court of Punjab and Haryana to get an order from the High Court to set up a trust, a temple trust, to protect the land. And I asked them, I said, why did you need to do that? And they said, because if we hadn't, the water would have been standing in our streets, and there would have been mosquitoes, and our children would have fallen sick. So the motivation to protect heritage was linked to a quality of life. And this is something which Ratish has already mentioned. So along with looking at, so the problem that we had at hand was not just about fixing the buildings and the wall paintings. There were social issues which were staring in our face. There were recent memories of sociocultural disruptions, because militancy in Punjab was a recent past, and the temple had been used as a police post. And there were contested recent social memories. They even had some contested narratives related to their relationship with the Thakurs of the village. So the project team, now I am mindful that I need to rush, and I don't have enough time to get into the nuances of this particular project. But what I would like to share, I'm going to just speak about the key takeaways. So the project team, which was funded by the United Nations Volunteers Program, were 2 conservation architects, 2 art conservators, and 2 social workers. Now, this particular model is something which is not enabled by the government model of doing conservation, where you prepare a detailed project report, you prepare the bill of quantities, and the contractor comes in with the cheapest labor or a captive labor that he parks on the site to conserve the building. Nor does he have the provision to have these additional, nor do the conservation professionals have the provision for these kind of practitioners as part of their team, because still today we do not have a standardized practice that what is a feasible fee for a conservation practice so that you can do justice to your work. So decay is not only because of aging, but also reflects social conditions. And this is something which Ratish has already spoken about. The professional conservators need to listen to what the community thinks about the people building to facilitate people's participation. There are living practices in a particular community, the way they engage with their sites, their public spaces, and so on, which the conservation professionals need to be sensitive to, that we actually marry those particular processes into our conservation methodologies. The culture of conservation work, collective work, allows exchange and interaction between the conservators and the community. And here, right outside the temple, we created our work yard. And we had a lot of children and young people who kind of came to look at what was happening, to understand the materials. The community, who are the caretakers, need to be empowered with the necessary skills. So to assume, even if the building was in a very bad condition, it was very interesting to see that how the community was looking after the temple. So we cannot work with slogans just because you see the decay in material fabric that people do not care. People care, but they do not have the resources to buy material and repair the building. And this is something which we need to understand as conservation professionals. Collective work allows exchange and interaction between the conservators and the community. The community, the caretakers, need to be empowered with the necessary skills to actually conserve. So in fact, our entire workforce came from the village itself. There were 3 masons there. There were a lot of young people, a lot of youth. Actually, it was very sad to see what the state of the education in the village school was, how the kids were spending their time. And that 1 year of professionals hanging around the village doing this work, it actually did the leapfrog, it actually got the village young people out of their inertia into thinking of a future and about engaging. And just the act of restoring a monument actually was such a healing process for the community that you actually saw them get additional, like oxygen in their blood, that they actually started dreaming about a better future as well. So the conservation of the monument is closely related to its outside environment. Sorry, my screen freezes. Conservation of the monument is closely related to its outside environment. It was very critical. In fact, the sociologist, the professor who was working with us, Dr. Sabyasachi, in order to engage the community, and we realized that the temple was at the highest part of the village, and to start conversations with the village, because we people came from the city. The people of the village were perceiving us in a particular way. They were thinking, for them not to feel threatened by us would have, we would have, actually, I'm sure a lot of people would have felt threatened that, that who are these people? What are they going to do with our temple? What are they going to do with the land? Are they on our side, or are they on the side of the man who is going to take away the land? So we need to understand that there are lots of questions running in the minds of these people amidst whom we go and start working. So we began working with the village drain because there was so much sludge outside the temple and all the rising damp that was happening in the temple that it was important for us to actually deal with the drain. And so Dr. Sabyasachi worked with the village youths and the team to actually clean the drains to get the water all the way to the village water tank. Now, this nuance is very important because where do you begin your conservation work when you get into these complex situations? The community needs to be familiarized with the principles and technology of conservation. It was very important for us to be able to, literally speak to them about what calcium oxide is. How does it carbonate? How does the lime mortar is a better mortar than a cement-based mortar? So we made it our business to actually talk to them in technical language, because to say, okay, we're going to simplify it for them because they don't understand is a way to undermine their dignity. So there were a lot of these little nuances which needed to become part of our culture, of our practice. The people were reintroduced to the use of these materials, the process of conservation and the role of the conservator, the documentation of the building initiated the process of sharing between the professional and the artisan. You actually see young people removing the lime wash from, the wall paintings. You actually see a mason who's working with the conservation architect, with measuring the temple to actually, to the making of the drawings. Conservation challenges, I won't go into this. This is fairly simple. Process of removal of the old roof. And I mean, there were some very, very interesting nuances, but I'm sure I'm running out of time. Wall paintings were like the highlight in terms of appreciating the architecture. All the problems needed to be understood. The art conservators worked with, the village community, but the village community, when I say community, there were a select number of young people who actually understood some of these aspects, and they were brilliant, to work with the art conservators. And the technical aspects related to conservation. So the question in terms of sustainability is that how to equip the community for times after the site has been conserved physically, how to facilitate collective participation in the conservation process. Now, these were some very, very critical, which actually became points of great contestation. I had to even invite the deputy commissioner to actually have a village level meeting to talk to people, because everybody expected that they were going to be the paid labor. And because there was an opportunity in a landscape which had such little opportunity, that there was, friction between community subgroups. So we had to deal with, and it was the men only who came in as the workforce. So it was the women also asking that we also want some opportunities. So it is when Ratish talks about the entire gamut of activities that he's dealing with in Nizamuddin, these questions come from the community themselves. A lot of different people have different interests, have different questions, and want to engage with the process. So how do you kind of, as a conservation professional, understanding the nuances and the materiality of it all, how do you make it into an ecosystem where people feel included? So interaction with children at school and out of school enthused them to participate in the non-formal education program around the site. Implementation of programs was largely dependent on the youth of the village. Again, something which Ratish has already spoken about, but this is clearly on a much smaller scale. And the way we got our funding was that we support for these kind of allied activities was that we actually interacted with the Office of the Deputy Commissioner to get the different programs under the rural development schemes, the Red Cross Society, and so on, and just facilitate those activities to happen in the landscape of the village, because those programs exist. It's just that we needed to be the bridge to connect those opportunities with the village community, and it was all linked to the conservation process of nature and culture. So basically between a tailoring school, about desilting the village water tank, this is a water tank and to be able to separate that every engagement is not going to bring monetary benefit, because then again, you disconnect. Seva is a tradition of Punjab. And they do this work of voluntary work for community well-being. And to be able to say, okay, every activity is going to be a paid activity is undermining a particular tradition. So those sensitivities needed to be built into the way we did our work. The social practices for sustainability exist within communities, which need to be strengthened. Without decentralization, the temple trust can or could have undermined the participation of different groups. And in the photograph, you actually see the deputy commissioner conducting that meeting with the village community. This is an important learning that we had, which is that properties associated with heritage sites need to be defined as commons for the community. And this is currently not protected by law. And this is something which needs to be closely examined. And development programs need to be oriented to the requirements of conservation and sustainability. Social problems alienate the community from its heritage. Therefore, these need to be dealt with as part of the conservation effort. This would make historic building a symbol of civil society. And this is something which I think but these learnings are not part of our development mainstream at all when we look at heritage practice today. So I feel that's where the crux of the challenges are. And the key learnings for me through my entire journey as a conservation architect is that recognizing heritage as that of a people, place, and material manifestation of time and memory. And memory can be as recent as like these particular people related to Thakurs, related to the militancy period of Punjab, they're related to their own personal narratives, to partition, a lot of this. And so that temple represents, they see the temple through those lenses of memory. And there requires to be an integral part, heritage requires to be an integral part of development projects and program, and the entire process needs to be dialogical because it cannot be, community participation is not about a meeting, a document, the DPR is being prepared and so on and so forth, but it needs to be constantly alive to the needs. And this is something which keeps moving. And unfortunately, the contractor model of heritage practice or the infrastructure model of development does not cater to this particular need. So there needs to be concerted effort to actually develop this particular into policy. And I do recall Prem writing to us that we need to think about what kind of heritage policy does the country need. And I think, my generation, Ratish's generation is the first generation of conservation practitioners in this country. And I think we've got 3 decades of experience now for several conservation professionals across multiple disciplines to actually brainstorm and, lobby and work towards something which is a more inclusive policy towards heritage practice. So thank you so much. And I apologize for the extra time that I may have taken.
Okay, thank you, Gurmeet. What I'm going to do is raise some questions on which I'll request responses from both of you. And I'll start with a point that both of you all made in different ways. Ratish, you made a statement that where there is heritage, there should not be poverty. And Gurmeet, you said that you spoke about heritage sort of underpinning a dream of a better future. So that suggests that the heritage project, not just an isolated monument, one is actually sort of preserving a community, one is and creating opportunity for that community where heritage acts as a catalyst. Could you comment on that? Ratish, do you want to go first?
What I've been saying, what His Highness the Aga Khan's been saying forever is using heritage as a springboard to improve quality of life, just as we've traditionally done with education and health. Often the heritage, whether it's the built heritage or the cultural heritage of craftsmanship, music, cuisine, is the only real asset some communities have. And it is, I think, the responsibility of conservationists, planners, officialdom to really connect, and of course, agencies such as ourselves or institutions to really connect these communities with economic opportunities. And some of the stark figures at Nizamuddin where we started, women dying in childbirth, 70 to 80% malnutrition, open defecation, less than 25% of houses not having toilets, 1% of women having economic opportunities, no opportunities for youth, and so we were able to address all of these issues. And about 30 kids from Nizamuddin have since gone to foreign universities. It takes a generation, it takes 10, 12, 15 years to really have an impact of any meaningful scale. Heritage needs to be seen as an economic asset, and only then will heritage have a future in this country. If heritage is seen as a burden, as it has been for all these years since independence, it's something that, oh God, we have to spend money taking care of these, then there is no future for conservation. In Europe, in UK, 55% of the construction industry budget is spent on conservation, not for anything else, but it's all an investment. The garden restoration that we carried out at Humayun's tomb not only was about 98% of invest in craftsman wages, but the investment since has been recovered year after year after year after in excess ticket sales. I mean, 1,000% ticket sales. And there are no other businesses associated with it. So what we've been trying to demonstrate is that heritage is an asset to ensure social economic development.
Thank you. Gurmeet?
I do believe that, the several situations that I've been in terms of heritage practice, one thing that becomes very critical is that cultural mapping is something which is a very important tool. And we use the word cultural mapping, and again, it kind of gets misunderstood that all we're interested in is everything to do with culture and the way culture is perceived as one silo, But to actually be able to look at any tangible heritage, because that becomes point of entry for us to, when we are brought into a particular space. But to be able to understand, to map who all are the community groups or subgroups or individuals or whatever, for in terms of who have a stake in this particular heritage. What is the context and how do they perceive this particular piece of heritage, and their engagement, how does it touch their lives, in the narrative of their lives, and to develop a program or to have the indulgence of developing a program. Now, the buzzword these days is about placemaking. And I think that placemaking can only be possible if you actually understand the landscape of that particular heritage site or the perspective of heritage that you're talking about. And I think all that, right now, if you kind of tell somebody that, okay, for heritage, I need to look at sewerage lines, I need to look at education, I need to look at this, that, and the other, they're going to actually feel that, look, you're not God here, how do you want to, you're not going to be changing everything for everybody here. So how do you, to develop a methodology where you actually see that through heritage, now when we looked at, when we were doing Kishan Court, we were doing that project under the program of culture of peace, that how do you enhance understanding between communities through using heritage as a tool for building a more peaceful society. Now, heritage in itself is not going to make peaceful society. It's if the lives of people are not going to get touched, through this intervention in the community, and heritage and culture is the language where it's a common language that you can arrive at, And that's what, that's what my learning is, that we need to develop the language of the heart, and that heritage actually provides that opportunity.
Does this not require looking at much more than heritage projects? I mean, I'm just as one example, in both your presentations, you talked about the necessity of high quality craftsmanship to be involved in restoring these projects. So one has to not just preserve monuments, but to preserve that, you've got to preserve a craft tradition, and the preservation of that craft tradition might have to be done at a broader scale than just within the context of specific projects.
Absolutely.
No, which is why I said, unless the same craft techniques are used in modern architecture, conservation in the future will not even be possible, because conservation at the low scale in which it is carried out in India cannot keep these craft skills alive. We've been able to train a lot of craftsmen over the course of the last 10, 15 years, many of whom have gone on to work on other important conservation efforts. But unless that happens, and you're also improving the quality of life of the person. So not only are you concerned about the building, but also traditionally, for example, we've just found a marble which sort of says that so and so was ordered. In fact, somebody was responsible for Jahangir's take care of Humayun's tomb, and was given so many craftsmen, so many revenue, and so on. So craftsmen have always been associated historically with these buildings. With the new national policy of the Archaeological Survey of India, it recognizes the fact that craftsmanship is important. But the ASI has not yet put in place any systems that would mean they can get out of this lowest tender process.
So I have a couple of points to make, Prem, and that is, with regard to a couple of matters on training. In 2012, is it when the CPWD came out with its schedule of rates, and lime had been removed as a material. I forget if it was 2012 or was it 16. We were waiting for the updated rates, and lime as a material had been removed. Now, this is the silo approach I'm talking about. Now, the second part that I'd like to make, like what Ratish has said, that these are very, very underpaid people. We want high quality work, but the rate analysis gives a certain rate to the skilled, semi-skilled, and the unskilled worker. Now, we're talking about master artisans here. So which means somewhere we need our rate analysis which supports the tender documents in our schedule of rates in such a way that it enables these artisans to be, for us to be patrons, the new day patrons, to get good quality work. Now, unless these processes are mainstreamed, the artisan is underpaid. You're telling him you have to do a good job. He's getting paid his 500 rupees, but you expect him to, kind of produce a high quality work and, in terms of even turnkey. How is it even possible? Now, there are umpteen international examples for us to even look at and see how is it possible. Now, I had come across one particular institution called the California Cadet Corps, something like that. And what these guys have done is that they've actually put together a whole lot of young people who are school dropouts. Invariably, how it relates to us is that we've got people who are into working with their hands, unfortunately, do not get to complete their school education or something. So if you were to draw a parallel this thing, these cadets are actually trained in a particular skill. They get informal education to be able to complete their school as well. And they get to work on projects where government projects actually picks up the cost of engaging these cadets so that they get a certain stipend to, and it is built into the federal projects. This is in the US. Now, I was thinking, now, is it so difficult for us? Now, this is a state subject. For state governments, Department of, the Public Works, the Culture Department, and so on, to have an institute for training, pick up the children of these master artisans who today are either disillusioned or are not interested in working with these skills, create schools for training, engage them with projects which are public projects of heritage conservation, build it into the cost of the project to actually engage these students there, because their outputs are going to probably be lower than the outputs of, people who have many more years of experience. So the point that I'm trying to make here is that we know where the gaps are. And the solutions are not difficult to find. We just need to come out, get out of our silo approach. And we need at least 4 or 5 of these different departments or ministries. Any state, any city can begin the creative process of being more inclusive and address some of these needs. And we need to crack the government systems for this. It cannot be done by just corporate sector. It cannot be done by just international aid. It has to be mainstreamed. And without that, we are not going to be able to make a difference, the kind of difference we should be making.
Thank you. Since you have talked about the government setup, let me raise a question that was on my list. And I see an echo of that question from Aishwarya Morwal in the audience too. Gurmeet, you mentioned about the Ministry of Tourism being one of the key ministries looking at heritage. Does that lead to a superficial approach where we look at heritage as entertainment? For example, we have had 3 sort of prominent and controversial projects. We've had the Central Vista, we've had the Kashi Vishwanath corridor in Varanasi, and more recently, Gandhi Sabarmati Ashram in Ahmedabad. And we see a phrase like world class attributed to each of these, which is a very touristy kind of phrase. Or the other recent case is the so-called restoration of the Jalyan Wallabag memorial, which has been, I think one commentator called it a Disneyfication of heritage, where the authenticity of the past is not at all respected and it's reduced to entertainment. So how do we take a deeper view? I mean, have we created a problem by reducing heritage to entertainment?
This is the sad story, in the sense that, I mean, if I were to look at how I've seen heritage conservation develop over the last 30 years, ministry, we all of us started working with ASI, we did management plans for some sites and so on. And slowly we realized that we saw that there was more activity in the Ministry of Tourism, and a lot of us got projects to work with heritage as part of projects funded by Ministry of Tourism, but as consultants to state governments. And heritage conservation, heritage destinations and heritage, whatever, pilgrimage circuits and all, became part of the programs of Ministry of Tourism. Now, on one hand, we understand that tourism is an important generator for wealth for a community, and through livelihood opportunities, which could be related to consumption of handicrafts, or it could be hospitality sector, and so on and so forth. The sad bit is that I don't know who, but we have not defined our heritage and what is important for us, what is meaningful for us. While the tourism programs and schemes and budgets have been growing over the last couple of decades, unfortunately, the Ministry of Culture has not been playing its role and playing catch up there. Because, from culture, it's gone to tourism becoming bigger, and now urban development through smart cities and all of that. So wherever this is happening, I mean, we know of the 3 examples you've given, or the 4th example, Jalyan Wallabag. This must be happening in a lot of cities. It's happened in Puri also, around Sri Jagannath Temple. They've created a corridor of 100 meters by pulling down all the mats around. And I'm sure it's happening across the board in many cities. These are not the only cities where this kind of heavy-handedness is happening. But where the problem, I think, is that we have not decolonized our way of looking at heritage. So what ASI defines as a Taj Mahal, a whatever, Qutub Minar and a Red Fort, we haven't gone beyond and created tools which defines historic urban landscape, which defines role of community and their rights to their heritage and all that. We haven't created. Now, if you look at what is the Ministry of Environment done, in the 70s and 80s, they created 6 acts for their wildlife protection, for their forests, for the tribal communities. Now, I'm not going into the thing of what has been operationalized more than the other, but in the culture domain, we have only one act, which is Ancient Monuments and Archaeological Sites and Remains Act. All it did was in 2010, it created a 300-meter buffer zone. And even for the buffer zone, for the 3,000 odd monuments, we don't have guidelines for development. We haven't developed the intellectual capital, which is responsive to our people, to our living traditions, to our ethos. And there's no intellectual development in this sector at all, which should inform policy and legislation and so on. We are actually, what I'd said in my earlier comment was that we're literally getting into, a knee-jerk reaction of fixing the tools and the protocols, because we haven't done the big thing. That parliamentary question that I was mentioning earlier, I forget the name of the minister. There was a parliament question where they were asked that how are you going to separate the sites of regional significance from the sites of national significance? And the minister said that we are in the process of articulating the statement of significance. They used a local word, but they said we are going to define the significance of these monuments, which is going to be the criteria for separating the two lists. But that definition never got done. Those 2 years never came to an end. So we have a challenge, and I do believe that any state and any city can demonstrate good practice. The point is that, because it's heritage is on the concurrent list and urban development on state list. States should be more serious about what they want to achieve in heritage.
Thanks, Gurmeet. Ratish, let me ask you to come in on that, but look at it from the opposite angle. We've been looking at it from the government angle, but how should we, the general public, perceive this question? Because we tend to look at heritage as belonging firmly to the past, but actually it's not so easy to separate past, present, and future, because heritage is also about very contemporary moments of choosing what is worth remembering. So the two are very interlinked. And what would we lose? I mean, perhaps one way to think of it is what would we lose if we didn't have built heritage? Yeah.
What would you lose if we didn't have built heritage? I think, when you talk about heritage, you're really talking about everything that ends up building up to architecture. And architecture, as all of us architects would like to believe, mother of all arts and so on. Now, some of these questions that you ask, clearly what Gurmeet is saying and is building is that, the way some of these projects are being done, these are not conservation projects. These are projects that are led by a government political viewpoint, which is outside the domain of this discussion. Similar work is being done around the Jagannath temple in Odisha, which I had the pleasure of looking at quite closely. And there, the government's intention is very, very honorable and quite unbelievably high professional. I think critically, heritage helps us root ourselves. We are not only economically connected to it, but emotionally connected to it. A lot of our work, for example, at Rahim's Mausoleum, which is at the corner of this site, is restoring it to the city skyline, because it's been so visible but ruined. The moment you add life to it, I think the city starts waking up to and gives joy to a lot of people. So heritage, I think the fact is not that what would we do if there is no built heritage. I think the fact is, what do we do with the built heritage that helps us achieve a lot of the government objectives, a lot of objectives that any government, any society aspires to.
Thanks. Let me ask a follow-up question to that, which is in a way linked, is that a lot of people view heritage from the viewpoint of singular narratives. What is the importance of heritage in a multicultural society? And there's absolutely no doubt that India is a very complex multicultural society. So because this has acquired certain ideological dimensions in the recent past, where people want to say that's our heritage, that's not our heritage, there's a true history. How do we tackle this question, which is?
I think one of heritage, as I said, can help achieve a lot of our objectives. One of which could be communal harmony. Heritage helps understand each other's religions. Heritage, when we do when all of us conservation people, not only architects, do heritage walks across the breadth of the country, you're really bringing alive associated intangible heritage, cultural heritage, religious heritage, and so on. And it really demonstrates to you, at the end of the day, what each religion stands for. And it's not as it is made out to be in today's political discussion. So heritage can, in fact, bridge that thing. But again, Prem, critically, we need to look at heritage, whether it's Muslim, Hindu, Sikh, Buddhist, or whatever heritage. We need to look at it at the very basic as an economic asset that needs attention. And if it is given proper attention, will give back manifold. What needs to be done in India is proper studies, either the Niti Aayog or God knows who, to figure out what is the value of our built heritage in really monetary terms, and what it can get to even to GDP of the country.
Gurmeet, you think we can bring the economic dimension as having primacy, or would you say that one cannot have a true heritage policy without a present inclusive community?
I think, if I were to speak from my own practice, I have never had the brief from anybody that your indicators of success is going to be what is the economic benefit of what you've done. So I would be inadequate to answer this question, but I do believe, my experience with Amritsar, I've been involved in the city of Amritsar for over almost 2 decades now. And when we started working in Amritsar, this very important fort called the Gobindgarh Fort, which hadn't even the army, handed over that fort to the government of Punjab about 15 years ago. This is probably the only fort where the army is actually handed a defense fort, cantonment area, transferred titles to a civil government. And heritage footprint, so-called heritage footprint of Amritsar was understood only as Sri Harmandir Sahib, the Golden Temple, and some other sacred shrines as well, and largely pilgrimage. But in the last decade and a half, we've restored the Gobindgarh Fort. There's a town hall that was restored with the partition museum in it, and several other things. I do recall about 5 years ago that the footfall in Amritsar in terms of tourists had increased hugely. And one of the indicators of this increased footfall was a number of hotels that were mushrooming all over the place, including in the vicinity of Harmandir, which of course is a problem. Now, problem because what does it do to the skyline? What does it do to the sound pollution and so on and so forth? So economic benefit definitely, I feel, is a byproduct. As far as if I can indulge myself here, but I guess if I were to look at it from the point of view of the local community who is looking for opportunities, economic opportunity is something they would be looking for, definitely for improving the quality of their lives. But the point is that we need to regulate a lot. We need to be prepared for the impact this is going to have. Like I said, those hotels that have mushroomed all around Harmandir Sahib, and in days to come, what I see is that plots are going to get consolidated. The new kind of guidelines are going to be following, because the moment your plot size becomes larger, they will have to do setbacks, and because of which the footprint of the walled city is going to change. The building typology is going to change. There's been not enough work to understand the values of that built heritage. There hasn't been enough work in the creative industry space, the artisans who live in the walled city and so on. But suddenly, it's going to open the floodgates for these people to come and acquire these properties and make hotels for whatever. So economic benefit is definitely important, but I think we need to create that ecosystem where we protect, you don't want to lose the baby with the bathwater, by just opening the floodgates to economic development.
Thank you. Let me ask one last question and then I'll turn to questions from the audience. The historical record behind a heritage project that you might face is not always clear in black and white. Sometimes there are gaps in the record. Sometimes there are contradictory records. Sometimes there have been several layers of intervention in a site, each old enough to be called heritage. What are the criteria by which you define authenticity of what you will eventually bring the project to? And in that authenticity, might you even choose to leave a part of the project as a ruin? Who would like to take that first? Ratish?
I think Ratish has asked these questions many more times than I am, so I think he should take this question.
The kind of work we do, it's not possible to do this without a historical record. And one of the classic examples has been, the recently completed work at Rahim's mausoleum in Nizamuddin. And this was a 6-7 year project supported by the Interglobe Foundation. And a lot of building had been reduced to ruin just by simple vandalism and taking away of material. And the result is that, and we all know that the dome was clad with marble, which was carried off to Saptajang's tomb. We, for both structural reason as well as to restore to the public an idea of what the dome originally looked like, put some marble back on the dome, and all hell broke loose amongst the senior archaeologists, saying you're rewriting history this has been removed once, it cannot be put back, which is absurd for a building which is suffering day in, day out because of the elements and so on. But yes, the world is moving on. The world is moving on. Conjecture, which was an absolute no-no in professional discussions, academic discussions till about a decade ago. A lot of people are now saying conjecture is fine under certain conditions. And especially in the case of buildings which are, which have other contemporary buildings to look at, and where missing elements are significant and enhance the significance of the building. So this is a very, very, this Prem is a topic that we can discuss endlessly. Unfortunately, there is not much academic discussion, much more of these discussions that we are having today in India. And as such, people often say there are two schools of thought in conservation. One is what we have been doing, as you've seen at some of these buildings in Sundar Nursery and so on, where they've been brought back from the brink of ruin, brink of collapse to doing nothing. And I respond to that saying there are not two schools of thought. There is no school of thought. There is no discussion. For a country as large as India, as diverse heritage in India, there is really absolutely nothing that counts for academic discussions today where we want to go with heritage.
Thank you. Now I'll start with questions from the audience. I'll start with the question from Yajurva Jagad. Forgive me if I don't pronounce names correctly. And her question, the question here is important, given that public-private partnerships tends to be the flavor of the day. Could corporate social responsibility be an important factor in improving, in heritage conservation in India, both the physical complex and the social lattice around it?
Absolutely, there's no two thoughts about it. We were, when it was Secretary, Mr. Ravinder Singh, who was Secretary Culture, who enabled, CSR funds to be used for conservation in India. And CSR is this incredible big pot, and even if 10% of that money comes into conservation, it will be game changing. We've had support from, I wouldn't call the Tata Trust as corporate because that's a different sort of entity, but we've had support from Indigo, Havels, for some of our very important projects. And that we're hoping are going to be model projects that will lead to several other corporates funding, because in the end of the day, heritage preservation, not only is it very visible, not only is it something that corporates can identify with, but is also something that meets, as I have shown you, a lot of other objectives: employment creation, sustainable development, all sorts of made in India, everything is local. So a lot of other government objectives, and with Baulis and so on, a lot of other government objectives can be fulfilled. Pride in community. So yes, I think CSR, and I mean nowhere else in the world is culture, music, dance, theater, or even conservation funded by the government. In the Philadelphia region of America alone, there are about 900 NGOs that raise money constantly. So at Sundar Nursery, what we're trying to do is we're trying to manage a park, a 90-acre city park, without a penny coming in from the government. On the Central Park in New York, it's not easy. But the only way these things will work in the future is if CSR funding keeps them going.
Gurmeet, would you like to add anything to that?
Actually, as much as, any money is good for heritage, but my concern, I would flag the same red flag again, because see, in the case of Adopt a Heritage Scheme, the corporate funding is coming, whether it's CSR or it's corporates coming in for whatever systems that have been put in place to enable their participation. The point is that who is preparing the conservation plan, and what are the checks and balances there? And my worry is when I think of the kind of methods and the systems that have unfolded in the recent years, with a lot getting bulldozed, a lot of compromises on materials and all of that, and processes related to communities are not part of the methodology.
But Gurmeet, sorry Gurmeet, but it's a chicken and egg story, because
no, but that's exactly what I'm saying. So I said, that's what I said. Good money is good to come, but the point is that there's a web there, there's an ecosystem there, and it has to be like the clapping has to happen with both the hands. So in the case of the work that Ratish is doing, you have a well-informed, heart in the right place, head in the right place organization that's receiving the funding and is doing this work. What if this is not there, and the money goes into a particular way to a local government to do some heritage conservation work? I've seen that happen, because I work in the unprotected space, and that doesn't make that heritage a lesser significant. But there needs to be some systems in place for that puts in the checks and balances as well.
But I think donors, themselves.
Let me take a slightly different dimension of that, because picking up from what Gurmeet said about checks and balances, and connecting that to the fact that heritage is really a matter of public memory. So should there be radical transparency required as a legally required for heritage projects? Because we've seen many projects, like the Central Vista and the projects I named earlier, where there was actually
Central Vista is not, it's in a heritage zone, but it's not a heritage project.
Yeah, it's not a heritage project, but it should have been too, but
Absolutely.
as part of it.
So,
But we've seen concerns about the lack of information about it. I understand that the Jalyan Wallabag makeover also did not talk to the Association of Survivors of people who, whose ancestors died over there or survived that place, that incident. So should there be a requirement of public transparency in all heritage projects?
I think, Prem, there are two different issues here. Just to carry on from your previous questions and Gurmeet's answer, I think Gurmeet is saying the checks and balances. What we have seen is, despite being the Aga Khan Trust for Culture, despite working in 30 countries on World Heritage Sites and so on, each time we've got a grant from, say, the Tata Trust or the Interglobe Foundation or the US Ambassadors Fund for Cultural Preservation. They come with very strict, or the German embassy, they come with very strict, requirements, and itself sets the standard of what we're going to do. You might not even get your second installment if you're sort of not, if you've not got a written out conservation plan. And yes, Prem, when the conservation at any conservation site is owned by the future. It's not owned by us. It's not owned by any individual, any institution, any agency. And absolutely, transparency is very critical. But what is critical is the conservation process, which is what, in my hurry to rush through my presentation, I tried to say. A conservation process must start with documentation, must do archival research, must understand the significance of the site, because what are we trying to do in the end? What part of the site are we trying to save? And it must be written out. And that's where we fail. A lot of our work in India, even on nationally protected sites or state protected sites, are not written out of what we're doing. It's done in, so there is no conservation plan. And that way, the UK Heritage Lottery changed the system in the UK, because Heritage Lottery is the biggest donor of money for heritage conservation projects in the UK. And mind you, the UK has 650,000 heritage buildings. Everybody needs money. They don't give you a penny till you have a written out, approved conservation plan. So the moment you start writing, you know what you're going to do, and then you have peer reviews and so on. So the conservation process must be followed, and that includes very high level of supervisions of conservation works, which again, without which again, however good your craftsman might be, it turns a well-meaning intended project into a disaster.
Prem, I'd like to say something here. I also would like to demystify some of this as well, because see, when I look at the local, because, one has worked in the urban space with monuments which are more modest and, but equally important for that community. I mean, where you're trying to do this work. Now, I look at the tools that have been developed in other parts of the country, other parts of the world. For instance, IUCN developed a tool called Enhancing Our Heritage. And their focus, and rightly so, it took me a while to get my head around that their focus is on site managers. It's not about, even if we were to look at the fraternity of the conservation professionals in this country, we may be about 500 odd, maybe few this way, that way. But the point is that there's too much heritage. Every city has lots of sites of significance. Every neighborhood has something important. And this is my experience from 2 cities in the Hriday program as well. And people, when you go, it seems that the site is uncared for. You go and touch it and try to do something to it. A lot of heads come up, they actually want to tell you about it. They want to know who you are, why are you touching this site, and so on and so forth. Now it becomes, if you look at that tool of enhancing our heritage, and I've, there's somebody I've worked with in the public arts space, Narendra from Shrishti, and he conducted a beautiful participatory platform between people in Amritsar to talk about, okay, what is significant about a particular site? If people get to articulate what is important for them about that site, and what are the attributes of significance in that, then the planning can happen by a professional. And And the caretakers and the city managers become very important. The local government becomes very important, because if our institutions of local governance do not get strengthened, one or two projects in the landscape is not going to make a difference. So, I mean, and then of course the corporate funding and all that becomes part of the narrative at a later stage. But to expedite this process, because if people normally think, okay, now the professionals are going to come and prepare conservation management plan, and it's going to take 2 years because they're going to do a lot of documentation and research, and we will never have solutions, and that's the end of it, and the monies are going to lapse. So what I'm saying is that there are ways and tools that exist where the managers of the sites are critical about the process, related to the process, and the communities that sit. And what you need is facilitators to get the first aspect of it right, which is articulating the significance and the attributes, the measurable attributes of that significance. So in the case of Jalyan, if they'd had one consultation or done a process for about a couple of months, that what does this site mean for Amritsar? What does this site mean for Punjab? What does this site mean for India? And got that right, they would not have goofed up all that they've goofed up. You know, simple thing that in that alley where General Dyer went in, you've got frolicking people and their mannequins there. Means somebody didn't even basically understand that Amritsar was under curfew when Jalyan massacre happened. So, I mean, that is how far removed the designers can be. So, I mean, I can give a whole 1 hour lecture on Jalyan. I did an article for the Stir magazine on this one. But I do feel that the solutions can be found by creating processes which are anchored in the conditions that we have in our country.
Okay, thanks. I'm going to club two questions. There's one from Bikramjit Chakrabarti, who acknowledges both our panelists today as his mentors, and asks why advanced non-destructive documentation techniques such as 3D laser scanning are not becoming a standard. Is cost the only constraint? And Ramesh Chand asks, should we aim to have a comprehensive digital repository of built heritage in India? Ratish, you talked about using laser scanning, so would you like to respond to this?
Bikramji was working with us when we did all of that laser scanning. And, you know, in 2008, we introduced the technology in India. And today, and we got a machine and so on. Today, you can hire a surveyor to do the work. And so I don't agree with him. I think it is the way the technology has moved in India is incredible. Rather than use our own machine and pay for the license we now just get a surveyor to do our laser scan. So it has indeed moved by leaps and bounds. And yes, it's a pity that we don't have a digital repository. It is a need of an hour. There are a lot of individual private efforts going on towards that, but it needs to be done on a much greater scale.
Should we aim for a digital repository?
Yes, yes, that's what I said. I mean, I think it's a pity it's not already there, but it needs to be. Yeah, and there are some private sector efforts which are trying to get there, but it needs to be done on a much more institutional, much larger scale. There are many efforts going on, both in government and outside, towards that objective, but there is not enough primary surveying. It's all based on secondary information.
Okay, we have a question from Arun Kumar, who asks, how do we assess the value of heritage to the current generation of people living around it? So if a community's aspiration to raise their standard of living is to actually bring down their heritage house or structure or move out of a heritage area, where does one draw the line? Gurmeet, you worked in a lot of what you call unprotected areas. You must have come across these kind of challenges often.
You know, it's like all situations are not the same. And what you're saying is definitely a overpowering, overwhelming condition, because the land value tends to go much higher than the value of the building on top. And then, of course, with families growing and partitions of properties and so on, the building doesn't make sense the way it gets all fractured and fragmented and and so on. Now, it all depends. Now, the solutions need to be found, but they can only be found depending on a particular context that you're working in and what kind of a asset, what kind of a heritage property or heritage building you're working with. Now, that is a fine balance that I think the professional needs to play with. And there's no one size fit answer for this particular question. I mean, in fact, one begins one's heritage practice with this question, and then you kind of realize that you find solutions as well. So it's not the most, I mean, it's a most common question, but you need to find answers for every property yourself.
Okay, I'm afraid we're coming up against our time limit, so I'm going to ask the last question. And for those whose questions went unasked, I can only offer the consolation that I have several unasked questions on my list alone. Prabhu Mudlapur asks whether conservation of lakes comes under your area of work. And if I can just add something to that, landscape conservation, ecological conservation, should all this be looked as a sort of continuous field together with heritage conservation?
So I wish I got introduced to ecological conservation much earlier than when I did. And I think it should happen naturally if you're engaging with conservation practice, from built heritage to nature. I mean, like I said, that internationally they've arrived at that platform of, they call it nature, culture, connecting practice. And if nothing else, one thing it does is it enriches your personal life a lot. And it's because, I mean, that's where activism and all of that depletes you of a lot of energy. But if you engage with nature, it kind of revitalizes your own existence. So I think even as a healing for the professionals themselves, they should just look at nature while they work with culture at the same time. But I think it's a no-brainer. And as far as I'm concerned, I wish I had started about 15 years earlier. But as far as my own practice is concerned, I now work with nature and culture together, actually, and community being the other pillar.
Ratish, is the last question. Why don't?
Yes, I think every monument setting needs to be understood. So the same processes that go in fixing a monument of understanding, documentation, archival research need to go through for its immediate setting. So often we are able to figure out what sort of plants were planted in a historic garden, if there was a historic garden. And if there was a historic water body, or like temple tanks or mosques, tanks or wuzus, then those very much come part of the conservation effort. They are historic. Nature conservation in terms of the Great Lakes is a separate profession altogether, and will not. But I did talk about the Baolis, both at Delhi and Nizamuddin and in Hyderabad that we are working in. And these are important heritage structures.
Okay, thank you. There is, as has been evident, there is a lot to discuss, and we could have many more such discussions, and maybe we should. Perhaps it requires more than a discussion. Perhaps it requires like-minded professionals like the two of you and others to come together and actually put up a white paper on a policy document about what direction heritage conservation should take in the future. So we will have further conversations about that. But thank you, Ratish, Nanda, and Gurmeet Rai, for your presentations, your thoughtful answers to the question. Thanks to BIC for hosting this event. And thank you all the audience for participating. We had over 100 participants in this event. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.